July 1941. Orsha, Belarus. The German soldiers had been winning for weeks. Everything was going according to plan. The Soviet Union was collapsing. City after city fell. Victory seemed certain. Then they heard it. A sound like nothing they'd ever heard before. Not the whistle of artillery shells. Not the roar of planes overhead. This was different. This was screaming. A high-pitched shriek that cut through the air like 1,000 demons howling at once. The sky turned orange. Rockets, dozens of them, streaking through the darkness, trailing fire behind them like falling stars. But these weren't stars. These were weapons. They slammed into the German positions with a force that shook the earth. Explosions erupted everywhere. Trees snapped like toothpicks. Men dove for cover. Trucks burst into flames. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the blast. And then, silence. The rockets stopped. The smoke cleared. The Germans crawled out of their foxholes, shaking, confused, terrified. What the hell was that? They didn't know it yet, but they had just met the Katyusha, Stalin's organ, the weapon that would haunt them for the rest of the war. This is the story of how a simple truck, mounted with rockets, became one of the most feared weapons on the Eastern Front. A weapon born out of desperation, built by hands that refused to surrender, and unleashed on an enemy that thought it had already won. This is the story of the Katyusha. Before we continue, if you love World War II history, hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you untold stories from the war every single week, stories that deserve to be remembered. Now, let's dive in. June 22, 1941. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. It was the largest invasion in human history. The Soviets weren't ready. Within days, entire armies were surrounded. Thousands of tanks destroyed. Hundreds of planes shot down before they even left the ground. The Wehrmacht moved like a machine, fast and brutal, cutting through Soviet defenses like a knife through butter. Stalin was in shock. His generals were terrified. The Red Army was bleeding to death. By the end of the first week, the Germans had pushed 200 miles into Soviet territory. Cities burned. Soldiers surrendered by the tens of thousands. It looked like the end. But Stalin refused to give up. He called his top scientists, his engineers, his best minds. He needed weapons, not tomorrow, not next month, now. Something that could hit the Germans hard. Something that could buy time. The problem was, the Soviets didn't have much. Their factories were being bombed. Their best equipment was already at the front, getting destroyed. They needed something cheap, something simple, something they could build fast and build a lot of. That's when the rocket scientists stepped forward. For years, Soviet engineers had been experimenting with rockets, not the big missiles we think of today. Small, simple rockets, cheap to make, easy to launch. But nobody had figured out how to use them in war. They were unreliable. They were inaccurate. They were toys. But now, with the Germans closing in, those toys were about to become something else. Something deadly. Moscow, June 1941. While the front collapsed, a group of engineers worked in secret. Their names wouldn't make the history books like generals or heroes. But what they were building would change everything. Andrei Kostikov, Georgy Langmak, Ivan Gavay. These men had spent years studying rockets, not for glory, not for fame, because they believed rockets could win wars. The idea was simple. Take a rocket, mount it on a truck, fire dozens at once, overwhelm the enemy with explosions before they even know what hit them. But simple ideas are hard to build. Rockets are tricky. They spin, they wobble, they fly in the wrong direction. One rocket, maybe you hit something, maybe you don't. But 40 rockets fired at the same time? That's a different story. That's an avalanche of fire. The team worked day and night. They didn't have fancy labs. They didn't have unlimited money. They had scraps, leftover steel, truck chassis pulled from civilian factories, rocket fuel mixed in basements. Stalin's orders were clear: make it work, make it fast. By late June, they had a prototype. The BM-13. 13 rockets mounted on rails, bolted to the back of a ZIS-6 truck. It looked rough. It looked improvised. Because it was. But when they tested it, it worked. The rockets launched with a roar. They screamed through the air, trailing smoke. They hit the target zone and exploded in a wave of fire and shrapnel. The engineers stood there, watching, covered in soot and dust. They looked at each other. They knew. This was it. Now they just had to get it to the front, before it was too late. The BM-13 wasn't pretty, it wasn't high-tech, but it was brutal. Here's how it worked. Take a regular truck, nothing fancy, the kind you'd use to haul supplies or move troops. Now bolt steel rails onto the back, 16 of them, each one angled up toward the sky. Load the rockets. Each one was about 6 feet long, packed with explosives, simple, solid fuel. A basic fin design to keep it somewhat stable in flight. Somewhat. The launcher could hold 16 rockets, all of them ready to fire in less than 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That's all it took to unleash hell. The crew didn't need much training. Aim the truck in the general direction of the enemy, set the angle, light the fuses, and run. Because when those rockets launched, the truck shook like it was going to fall apart. Flames shot out the back, smoke filled the air. The noise was unbelievable, and that was the point. The Katyusha wasn't designed to be accurate. You couldn't hit a single tank with it. You couldn't snipe a building. That's not what it was for. It was designed to saturate an area, to blanket an entire grid square with fire, to create chaos, fear, confusion. One Katyusha battery, 4 or 5 trucks, could fire 80 rockets in under a minute. 80 rockets screaming through the sky, landing in a zone the size of a football field. Everything in that zone? Gone. Trucks, ammunition dumps, troop positions, command posts. It didn't matter. If you were in the impact zone, you weren't walking away. And the best part? After firing, the trucks could drive away, fast, before the enemy even knew where the attack came from. Mobile, deadly, cheap to build. Stalin loved it. Now they just needed to use it. July 14th, 1941. Orsha, Belarus. The Germans had taken the city. Their supply lines stretched for miles. Fuel trucks, ammunition, troops resting after weeks of non-stop fighting. They thought they were safe here. The Soviets were retreating. The front was collapsing. But something was coming. Under the cover of darkness, a small convoy rolled into position. 7 trucks. No lights, no noise, just the quiet rumble of engines. They stopped on a hillside overlooking the German positions. The crews worked fast. They angled the launchers, checked the rockets, loaded the rails. Everything had to be perfect. This was the first time, the first real combat test. Captain Ivan Floyorov commanded the battery. He was young, nervous, but he believed in the weapon. He had seen it tested. He knew what it could do. He gave the order, fire. The first rocket launched with a roar, then another, and another. 16 rockets from each truck. 112 rockets total, all of them screaming into the night sky, trailing fire like comets. The Germans heard it first. That sound, that horrible shrieking sound, like a freight train mixed with a banshee's wail. It cut through the silence of the night. Then the explosions began. The rockets slammed into the German positions in waves. Trucks exploded. Fuel depots erupted into fireballs. Ammunition boxes detonated in chain reactions. Men scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The entire area was ablaze. It lasted less than a minute. Then silence. The Soviet crews didn't wait. They reloaded. No, they didn't. They started the engines and drove away, fast, into the forest, into the darkness. Gone before the Germans even knew what hit them. When the sun came up, the German commanders surveyed the damage. Dozens of vehicles destroyed, supplies gone, men dead or wounded. And nobody knew what weapon had done it. They radioed back to headquarters, described the sound, the fire, the chaos. The reports spread through the German ranks like wildfire, whispers, rumors, fear. What the hell was that? The Soviets didn't tell them. Stalin himself issued orders. The weapon was top secret. If a Katyusha was about to be captured, destroy it. Blow it up, leave nothing behind. The Germans would find out soon enough. But for now, the Katyusha was a ghost, a screaming, fire-breathing ghost. And it was just getting started. The Germans had a name for it, Stalin's organ. Because when those rockets launched, one after another, it sounded like a massive church organ. Deep, roaring notes that built into a screaming crescendo. A sound that filled the air and crawled into your bones. But it wasn't music. It was death. German soldiers who survived a Katyusha attack described it the same way. The sound came first. Always the sound. That rising shriek that made your stomach drop. You couldn't see the rockets yet. You just heard them, coming, getting louder, getting closer. Then you saw the trails. Lines of fire cutting through the sky, dozens of them, streaking toward you like angry meteors. And then, impact. The ground erupted, trees shattered, earth flew into the air. The shockwave knocked men off their feet. Fire spread everywhere, smoke so thick you couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And the worst part, you had no warning, no time to prepare. 1 second, you're sitting by a fire, eating dinner, writing a letter home. The next second, the world is ending. That's what made the Katyusha so terrifying. It wasn't just the explosions. It was the psychological impact. German troops called it the devil's music. Some said they'd rather face a tank charge than hear that sound again. At least with tanks, you could fight back. You could dig in. You could aim your weapon. But against the Katyusha, there was nothing you could do. You just waited, hoped, prayed the rockets wouldn't land on you. Soviet commanders understood this. They used the Katyusha not just to destroy targets, but to break morale, to make the enemy afraid, to make them hesitate. And it worked. German soldiers started flinching at every distant sound. Was that thunder or rockets? Was that wind or the beginning of another attack? The fear spread, unit to unit, front to front. By the end of 1941, every German soldier on the Eastern Front knew about Stalin's organ, and every one of them dreaded hearing it. The Soviets kept the weapon secret as long as they could. But the sound, you can't hide a sound like that. It echoed across the battlefield, a reminder, a warning. The Red Army was still fighting, and they had teeth. The Katyusha worked. Now they needed more, a lot more. But there was a problem. The Germans were closing in on Moscow. Soviet factories were being bombed. Workers were being evacuated. The entire industrial heartland was under threat. Stalin made a brutal decision. Move the factories east, beyond the Ural Mountains, where German bombers couldn't reach. It was chaos. Entire factories were dismantled, piece by piece, loaded onto trains. Workers, their families, the machinery, everything. Thousands of train cars heading east into the freezing wilderness of Siberia. They arrived at empty fields. No buildings, no power, no heat, just snow and wind and orders to start building. So they did. Within weeks, factory floors appeared. Tin roofs, wooden walls. Bare minimum. It was cold, brutally cold. Workers wore every piece of clothing they owned. Their breath froze in the air. Their fingers went numb. But they built rockets. The assembly lines ran day and night. Women took over most of the work. The men were at the front, fighting, dying. So the women stepped up, welding steel, mixing rocket fuel, loading explosive charges. Teenagers worked alongside their mothers. Some were 14, 15 years old enough to hold a wrench, old enough to contribute. They didn't have much. Food was rationed. Heat was scarce. But they had purpose. Every rocket they built was a rocket fired at the Germans. Every launcher that rolled off the line was another weapon for the Red Army. Another chance to push back, to survive. The production numbers were staggering. By the end of 1941, dozens of Katyusha batteries were operational. By 1942, hundreds. By 1943, thousands of rockets were being produced every single day. Stalin demanded more, always more. The factories couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. And they didn't. The workers knew what was at stake. Their country, their families, their lives. The Germans weren't just invading, they were destroying everything, burning villages, killing civilians. This wasn't just a war, this was survival. So they kept building, in the freezing cold, in the darkness, with blistered hands and empty stomachs. They built rockets, and those rockets were shipped west, to the front, to the fight. The Katyusha wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a symbol, proof that the Soviet Union could still produce, could still strike back, could still fight. And the Germans were about to find out just how many Katyushas were coming their way. If you're enjoying this story, do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. We spend hours researching every video to bring you the real history. Your support keeps these stories alive. All right, let's keep going. August 1942, Stalingrad. The city was dying. German bombers turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. Artillery pounded day and night. Soldiers fought street by street, building by building, room by room. It was hell on earth. The Soviets were desperate. They couldn't let Stalingrad fall. If the city fell, the entire southern front would collapse. The oil fields of the Caucasus would be next. And then the war might be lost. Stalin sent everything he had: troops, tanks, supplies, and Katyushas. The rocket batteries arrived under cover of darkness. They set up on the east bank of the Volga River, hidden among the ruins and forests. From there, they could hit German positions across the water. In the city itself, the Germans controlled most of Stalingrad by now. They had pushed the Soviets back to a thin strip of land along the riverbank, a few factories, a few streets. That's all that was left. But the Katyushas gave the defenders something they desperately needed: firepower. When German troops massed for an attack, the rockets came, screaming out of the sky, slamming into their assembly areas, tearing through infantry, destroying vehicles, breaking up assaults before they even began. The sound echoed through the ruined city, that terrible, shrieking sound. It became the soundtrack of Stalingrad, a constant reminder that the Soviets were still fighting, still dangerous. Soviet commanders used the Katyushas carefully. They couldn't waste rockets. Every shot counted, so they waited, watched. And when the moment was right, they unleashed hell. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We hear Stalin's organ almost every night now. The sound alone is enough to make men weep. We do not know where it comes from. We cannot stop it. We can only pray it does not find us." By November, the tide was turning. The Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive, Operation Uranus. They encircled the German Sixth Army, trapped them inside the city, and the Katyushas kept firing. They hit supply lines, airfields, command posts. Anywhere the Germans tried to hold, the rockets didn't stop. Day after day, week after week, the Germans were starving, freezing, running out of ammunition, and still the rockets came. By February 1943, it was over. The German Sixth Army surrendered. 90,000 men marched into captivity. The rest were dead. Stalingrad had held, and the Katyusha had played its part. The weapon that started as a desperate experiment was now a proven killer, a symbol of Soviet resilience, a nightmare for anyone who stood in its way. But the biggest test was still to come. July 1943, Kursk. The Germans were planning something big. Everyone knew it. The largest tank offensive in history. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of men, elite units, new weapons. Hitler wanted one more massive victory, one more chance to break the Red Army. The Soviets knew it was coming. Their spies told them, their scouts confirmed it, so they prepared, and they brought the Katyushas, hundreds of them. This wasn't going to be a surprise attack. This was going to be a wall of fire. Soviet commanders positioned Katyusha batteries all along the front line, hidden in forests, dug into hillsides, spread out so the Germans couldn't hit them all at once. The plan was simple. When the Germans attacked, hit them with everything. July 5th, 4 in the morning. The Germans were ready to launch their offensive. Tanks lined up, infantry in position, artillery crews loading shells. Then the Soviets struck first. The Katyushas opened up, all at once. Hundreds of launchers, thousands of rockets. The sky lit up like daylight. The sound was deafening, a roar that drowned out everything else. The rockets slammed into German positions before the attack even started. Fuel trucks exploded. Ammunition depots went up in massive fireballs. Tanks were hit before their engines even turned on. It was chaos. The German offensive launched anyway. They had no choice. Orders were orders. But they were already bleeding, already disorganized, already afraid. As the tanks rolled forward, the Katyushas kept firing, battery after battery, hitting assembly areas, supply routes, staging points. Anywhere the Germans tried to concentrate their forces, the rockets found them. One German tank commander radioed back, "We are under constant rocket fire. We cannot form up. We cannot advance without taking casualties. This is madness." But they pushed forward anyway, for days, for weeks. The battle raged across the Kursk salient, the largest tank battle ever fought. Nearly 6,000 tanks clashing across the open steppe. And through it all, the Katyushas fired. They didn't win the battle alone. Soviet tanks fought hard, infantry held the line. Artillery pounded the Germans day and night. But the Katyushas added something else: fear, disruption, a constant threat that the Germans couldn't escape. By mid-July, the German offensive was broken. They had lost thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of men. They retreated, and they never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front again. Kursk was the turning point. The moment the Red Army proved it could not just defend but destroy the Wehrmacht. and the Katyusha had been there, screaming, burning, unleashing fury on an enemy that thought it was unstoppable. The Germans were learning a hard lesson. The Soviets weren't just surviving anymore, they were winning. The Red Army was on the move, no more retreating, no more desperate defenses. Now they were pushing west, taking back everything the Germans had stolen, city by city, mile by mile, and the Katyushas led the way. By now, every Soviet army had Katyusha battalions. They were standard equipment, essential. Commanders planned their offensives around them. The tactics were refined, perfected. Before an assault, the Katyushas would fire, saturate the German lines, break up their defenses, create gaps for the infantry and tanks to punch through. It worked, over and over again. In Ukraine, the Katyushas smashed German positions along the Dnieper River. Rockets rained down on fortified towns, on bridges, on supply depots, clearing the way for the Red Army to cross. In Belarus, Operation Bagration destroyed an entire German army group. The Katyushas fired day and night, supporting every phase of the offensive, hitting retreating columns, blocking escape routes. The Germans were in full retreat now, but they fought hard. Every river, every town. They dug in, built defenses, tried to slow the Soviets down. It didn't matter. The Katyushas kept coming. Soviet rocket brigades became mobile strike forces. They'd move up close to the front, fire, relocate, fire again. The Germans couldn't pin them down, couldn't counter them. By the time German artillery tried to respond, the Katyushas were gone. One Soviet officer described it like this: "The Katyusha is our hammer. We use it to break the enemy, to soften them, to make them afraid. Then our tanks finish the job." By early 1945, the Red Army was inside Germany, pushing toward Berlin. The end was near, and the Katyushas were there for the final push. In the suburbs of Berlin, Soviet forces surrounded the city. Katyusha batteries moved into position, hundreds of them, aimed at the heart of the Nazi regime. They fired into the city, into German defensive positions, into strongpoints, into bunkers. The rockets fell like rain. The sound echoed through the streets, that terrible shrieking sound. The same sound German soldiers had feared since 1941. Now it was here, in their capital, in their homes. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. A week later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Katyusha had travelled thousands of miles, from the desperate days of 1941, through Stalingrad, through Kursk, all the way to Berlin. It had become one of the most recognised weapons of World War II, a symbol of Soviet power, of resilience, of revenge. But its story didn't end there. The war was over. But the Katyusha's story was just beginning. Armies around the world had watched. They had seen what rocket artillery could do, the speed, the firepower, the terror. And they wanted it. Within years, every major military was developing their own version. The Americans built the M270 multiple launch rocket system. The British developed their own designs. The Chinese created the Type 63. Even smaller nations wanted rocket artillery. It was cheap. It was effective, it was the future, but none of them had the same impact as the original, the Katyusha. The Soviet Union kept improving it. Bigger rockets, better accuracy, longer range, new vehicles. By the Cold War, Katyusha systems could fire rockets over 20 miles, could hit targets with devastating precision. They showed up in conflicts all over the world: Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Africa. Anywhere Soviet weapons were sold or supplied, the Katyusha followed. The sound remained the same, that shrieking, terrifying roar. Soldiers in different wars, different decades, different continents, they all described it the same way, like nothing else, like death itself had a voice. But beyond the battlefield, the Katyusha became something else, a cultural icon. In Russia, it's still celebrated, songs were written about it, monuments built. Veterans who served in Katyusha units were treated as heroes. Because the weapon represented more than firepower, it represented survival. The moment when the Soviet Union stopped retreating and started fighting back. There's a famous Soviet song called Katyusha. It's not about the weapon. It's about a girl waiting for her soldier to come home. But the name became linked, the weapon and the song, both symbols of hope, of endurance. Today you can still see Katyushas in museums, in parades. Some are still in service in parts of the world. 80 years later, the design still works. Modern rocket artillery is far more advanced now. Guided rockets, computer targeting, precision strikes. But the concept? The idea of mounting rockets on a mobile platform and unleashing them all at once, that came from the Katyusha. It changed how wars are fought. It proved that simple, mass-produced weapons could be just as deadly as expensive, high-tech ones, sometimes more deadly. It showed that in war, fear is a weapon too, and sound can be just as powerful as explosives. The Katyusha wasn't just a rocket launcher, it was a revolution. July 1941, a handful of trucks, a few dozen rockets, a desperate gamble. That's how it started. The Soviet Union was on the edge of collapse. German tanks were racing toward Moscow. Entire armies were surrounded. Millions of soldiers were dead or captured. It looked like the end. But in that darkness, Soviet engineers built something, not because they had unlimited resources, not because they had time, but because they had no choice. They built the Katyusha. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't precise, it was rough, loud and brutal. But it worked, and more than that, it scared people. The Germans had faced artillery before. They had faced tanks. They had faced planes. But the Katyusha was different. It was the sound. That horrible, screaming sound that warned you death was coming, but gave you no time to escape. It broke something inside men, made them hesitate, made them afraid. And that fear spread, from Orsha to Stalingrad, from Kursk to Berlin. Everywhere the Red Army went, the Katyusha followed. A reminder that the Soviets were still in the fight, still dangerous, still coming. But the Katyusha was more than just a weapon. It was proof of something deeper. It showed what people can do when their backs are against the wall, when survival isn't guaranteed, when the only choice is to fight or die. Soviet factory workers built those rockets in freezing warehouses. Women and teenagers welded steel with numb fingers. They didn't have heat, didn't have enough food, but they kept working, because every rocket mattered, every launcher mattered. And it worked. The weapon that started as a desperate experiment became one of the most feared tools of World War II. It didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it played its part. It gave Soviet commanders a tool they could rely on. It gave Soviet soldiers hope. And it gave the Germans nightmares. 80 years later, the Katyusha is still remembered, still respected, still studied. Because it wasn't just about the rockets. It was about the people who built them, the soldiers who fired them. The nation that refused to surrender. The Katyusha roared, and the world listened. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you think. We read every single one. New World War II documentaries every week. See you in the next one.